Today's episode of History Graveyard visits the pine forests of central Minnesota, where this memorial was once rumored to be the final resting grounds of Boston Corbett, the unusual soldier and later recluse who became a national celebrity in the United States days after the end of the American Civil War by his shooting of John Wilkes Booth, the man who killed President Abraham Lincoln at Fort Sumter in Washington, D.C. on April 14, 1865. If you ask the locals living today in Hinckley, Minnesota, as I did when visiting the Hinckley Fire Museum recently, they still claim that among the 1894 tragic fire's 418 victims was the one and only Boston Corbett. Author Scott Martell, in his definitive biography of Corbett entitled The Madman and the Assassin, discounts that narrative, stating that it was a different Thomas Corbett who died in that fire, and that the theory that it was Boston Corbett is, quote, too tenuous a connection to merit, unquote. I'll be using that terrific biography as a main source for most of the information in this video, and I do feel that this tenuous connection to the horrific Hinckley fire may indeed not be factually based. However, another author, former news anchor Bill O'Reilly, disagrees, writing in his book Killing Lincoln, that Boston Corbett did indeed perish in the Hinckley fire. He writes on page 293 of that bestseller that Corbett, quote, was sent to an insane asylum after branding a revolver at the Kansas State Legislature. He escaped, then moved north to Minnesota, where he died in the Great Hinckley Fire of 1894. He was 62, end quote. There are some issues with that quote, as this video will get to in due time. Since there is no known grave verified as the final resting place of Boston Corbett, this memorial is as good a place as any to begin this video. This is a memoriam to the 400 plus victims of the tragic 1894 Hinckley fire. I'm in Hinckley, Minnesota, and this beautiful, very massive memorial dates from September 1st, 1899. As you can see, it's next to a fairly active county highway, and the memoriam was built exactly 5 years to the day after the tragic fire in 1894. Dedicated, as you can see, September 1st in 1900. It was actually 6 years later. And each of the four sides of this beautiful statue have a little more information about the Great Hinckley Fire. Again, it was dedicated in 1899, 5 years after the fire was built, and erected 6 years to the day after that horrible fire. They called it the Great Hinckley Forest Fire of 1894. And as this side explains, that fire claimed the lives of over 400 victims, 418 to be specific, women, men, children. The fire itself was in this area, Minnesota, and it spread over 400 square miles. Different villages, Hinckley, Sandstone, Mission Creek, and Brook Park. So who was Thomas P. Boston Corbett? That story is one that this video will try to provide, even if his death and final resting place are still in question. 8-year-old Thomas P. Corbett arrived in New York City in October 1840 along with his family, Father Bartholomew, older siblings Emma and John. Their mother Elizabeth was not on a ship, the Zenobia, which brought the Corbett's to America, but it is unclear whether she had died back in England before this trip. The Corbett family arrived in New York City in 1840, settling at 276 Mott Street in Manhattan, near the famed Five-Point slums of New York City. It was a hard-scrabble upbringing, and the young Thomas eventually apprenticed in the hat-making trade, a livelihood which likely led to some of his later unusual behaviors. The top hat was quite fashionable in the mid-19th century. Think of the classic images that depicted the man who would indirectly lead to Corbett's fame, the future president Abraham Lincoln, proudly wearing a top hat, And although these hats were typically woven from a silk weave of either wool or fur felt, the hat-making process in the 1800s often involved the mixing of a mercury-based compound, which led many in the profession to display symptoms that historians now feel could be directly attributed to frequent exposure to that dangerous liquid chemical element. These symptoms could include distorted speech, unsteady balance, and even bouts of paranoia. It was so common for hat makers to display this odd behavior that the expression "mad as a hatter" was used by the early 20th century to describe many in the industry, and Lewis Carroll used the character of the Hatter, often called the Mad Hatter, in his 1865 story Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. The effect of Corbett's work as a hatter is another one of the mysteries surrounding his life, but he certainly began demonstrating odd behavior as a young man while working in this profession. Examples of this strange behavior certainly began to follow. A brief marriage to a woman named Susan Rebecca, maiden name unknown, who was more than a dozen years older than Boston, who was in his early 20s when the couple married. They moved from Troy, New York to Richmond, Virginia, where the deeply religious and abolitionist couple struggled, now living in an antebellum South that still allowed slavery. Deciding to return to New York City, Susan died tragically at sea on August 18, 1856, and the devastated Corbett moved to the city of Boston, where he obtained his lifelong nickname, while also trying to mask his grief by turning to alcohol and membership in a deeply religious local church. Perhaps affected by his prolonged exposure to mercury after Susan's death, the hat maker began acting more erratically, growing his hair long and parting it in the middle and patterning himself after Jesus. He also swore off temptation from the female sex by performing a botched self-castration less than 2 years after his wife's death. Bouncing around from job to job and seeing the nation torn apart over slavery, he constantly preached his vision of a radical religion on street corners in cities in the Northeast. It was the era of radicals like John Brown and crucial Supreme Court rulings such as Dred Scott. The United States was drifting closer and closer to conflict. After shots rang out at Fort Sumter in South Carolina on April 12, 1861, Corbett wasted little time and enlisted for a 3-month stint in the U.S. Union Army on April 19, 1861, which, after a brief time in the middle of the war back in the hat industry in the Northeast, ultimately would become 4 years of military service, culminating in the post-war task of hunting down Lincoln's killer, John Wilkes Booth. While serving initially for the 12th Regiment and later for the 16th New York Cavalry for the Union Army, Boston Corbett gained a reputation as a deeply religious soldier who was a brave and fierce fighter. Yet he was constantly getting into scuffles with both the fellow soldiers he was serving with, as well as the Confederate soldiers he was fighting in battles, such as at Harper's Ferry in Virginia. In June 1864, he was captured by Southern troops near Centerville, Virginia, and sent to the notorious Andersonville prison camp in Americus, Georgia, where he survived a brutal 6-month imprisonment before being released in a hostage exchange around the beginning of 1865. While slowly regaining some of his lost weight and energy, Boston Corbett had one more important Civil War-related task in front of him, necessitated by the intense manhunt for Booth following Lincoln's assassination on April 14, 1865. The shooting of Lincoln at Ford's Theater in Washington, just days after Robert E. Lee's Virginia Army had surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, is a story that is taught in most high schools. And the intense manhunt to find Lincoln's killer, John Wilkes Booth, had also been covered extensively. The 2024 miniseries, Apple Plus aired, called Manhunt, was based on the best-selling 2007 book of the same name by the late author James L. Swanson, and it devoted 2 episodes to the chase, with actor William Mark McCullough playing Corbett in the search for Booth that eventually ended with Booth's death by a gun fired by Corbett a dozen days after Lincoln's killing. After Corbett shot Booth, there was a drawn-out congressional debate on who was entitled to the large rewards for Booth and some of the conspirators' capture and killing. The substantial amount of money, which would be more than $2 million in purchasing power in 2025 US dollars, would certainly have changed Corbett's life back in 1865 and ultimately did define Corbett's erratic actions following the manhunt. The task of chasing down and finding Booth fell to the 16th New York Cavalry, and Corbett was part of a 24-strong regiment that spent 2 weeks chasing the assassin. There was no doubt it was shots from Corbett's gun through cracks in the barn wall at Garrett's farm in Virginia that had felled Booth, and many newspapers championed Corbett as a national hero, with the Associated Press saying that he was now greatly lionized. And on the street, Corbett was repeatedly surrounded by citizens who manifested their appreciation of his services by loud cheers. His newfound notoriety had its negative elements as well. Southern sympathizers sent him death threats, and Corbett began carrying a gun with him at all times for protection. Inaccurate news was reported that he had been shot and killed at a Baltimore tavern. Gradually, Boston Corbett's life faded a little from the national limelight, and he moved back to New York to continue working in the hat industry. He was also regularly invited to speak at religious gatherings about his deep Christian faith. He moved to several different cities and tried his hand at several different jobs over the next decade, including serving as a janitor for the pay rate of $1.50 a day at the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. He also continued to experience both physical ailments from his military imprisonment at Andersonville, as well as mental breakdowns, perhaps attributed to the mercury exposure. In 1878, he moved to the Kansas frontier. He staked claim to 80 acres of rocky land near the town of Concordia in Cloud County, Kansas, and began a failed career as a sheep farmer while continuing to wear his Union hat, keeping his hair long, and carrying several firearms while living a remote, day-to-day life in the rural Kansas countryside. He unsuccessfully tried to petition for an early Army pension from his Civil War service days, while his mental health continued to decline. By 1887, with his farm greatly in debt, he accepted a ceremonial job as a doorkeeper at the Kansas House of Representatives. It was here, while performing this job, that he ran into trouble, accusing some visitors to the state building of making a joke at his expense and threatening them with one of his guns. He was arrested, put on trial, and found mentally unstable, ultimately being sent to the Kansas State Insane Asylum at the Topeka State Hospital in April 1887, where he resided for more than a year. In May 1888, a 12-year-old boy named Clarence Dennis arrived to visit an inmate's son at the hospital. Clarence tied his pony to a post outside the building, and Boston Corbett, who was out for a daily march outside the hospital grounds, seized on the opportunity to jump on the horse and ride away. It was shades of John Wilkes Booth escaping from Ford's theater more than 2 decades earlier. But, unlike that attempted escape to freedom, Corbett was never caught. There were occasional supposed sightings of the fugitive in different places like Oklahoma, Idaho, Texas, Mexico, Montana, and Minnesota, but none were ever substantiated. One gentleman's claim made by a Texas man, also named John Corbett, that he was the genuine Boston Corbett, was likely made in an attempt to cash in on the veteran's Civil War pension check. That one was pronounced invalid when the Texas man turned out to be about a half-foot taller than the 5'5" Boston Corbett. Much like the discrepancy over which Thomas Corbett perished in the tragic 1894 Hinckley, Minnesota fire, the question about whatever happened to the true Boston Corbett may never officially be answered to historical satisfaction. This YouTube channel, quite honestly, cannot answer that question, nor can I show you his ultimate grave. So we will end this historical look with one last video of the turn of the century memorial to the hundreds of people victims of the horrible Hinckley fire. Boston Corbett, the man who shot Lincoln's killer, John Wilkes Booth, and whose life was filled with tragedy and mystery, simply faded off into the nether reaches of American history. Please remember to subscribe to History Graveyards for more biographical videos and important figures, as this site continues to visit cemeteries and profile individuals who deserve to be recognized. Thanks for watching.